In the shadow of the Kiamichi Mountains, a woman lived like a wild animal in a limestone cave, her mind shattered by grief and her body wasting away from starvation. When a Choctaw warchief named Molly found her cowering in the darkness, barefoot and covered in filth, he had no idea she was the widow of a respected merchant, or that his decision to bring her back to civilization would transform not just her life, but the future of an entire community. This is the story of how compassion in the wilderness became a bridge between two worlds. Martha Colvin woke to the sound of birdsong filtering through the mouth of the cave, a sound so ordinary it felt almost cruel. She lay curled on her side atop a bed of dried leaves and moss, her body aching from the cold stone beneath her. The dress she wore, once a respectable calico print, hung in tatters around her frame, the fabric stained with dirt and torn at the sleeves. Her feet were bare, the soles thick with calluses and crisscrossed with old cuts that had healed badly. She didn't remember the last time she'd worn shoes. Didn't remember the last time she'd cared about such things. She didn't know what day it was. Didn't know what month. Time had stopped meaning anything after Thomas died, after the fever took him and left her hollow and broken in a world that suddenly made no sense. The seasons changed around her, spring to summer to the first hints of autumn, but it all blurred together like watercolors running in the rain. The cave had become her entire world. It sat halfway up a rocky hillside in the Kiamichi wilderness of southeastern Oklahoma, hidden behind a curtain of wild grapevines and scrub oak that turned gold and crimson with the changing season. The opening was just wide enough for her to slip through, and inside, the space stretched back about 20 feet before narrowing into darkness. Water dripped somewhere in the depths, a constant rhythm that had become the pulse of her existence. The only sound besides her own breathing that reminded her she was still alive. She rose slowly, her joints stiff and protesting. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a familiar companion now. A constant ache that had become so much a part of her, she barely noticed it anymore. She'd eaten yesterday, she thought, or maybe the day before. A handful of persimmons she'd found near the creek, their sweetness almost painful against her tongue. Some wild onions she'd dug up with her bare hands, the dirt still clinging to the papery skin. A few pawpaws that had fallen from the tree she'd discovered deeper in the forest. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Her dresses hung loose on a frame that had once been fuller, healthier, and her ribs showed through the fabric when she moved. But food required leaving the cave, and leaving the cave required courage she didn't always have. Some days, the thought of stepping into the open air, of being visible and vulnerable, filled her with such terror that she stayed curled in the darkness for hours. Waiting for the panic to subside, Martha moved to the entrance and peered out through the vines. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley below, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold. The forest was alive with sound, the chatter of squirrels gathering acorns for winter, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of wind through autumn leaves that had begun their slow descent to earth. Once, she would have found it beautiful. Once, she would have stood in wonder at the way light filtered through the canopy, at the way morning mist clung to the hollows. Now it just felt vast and indifferent, a world that continued turning without her. Without Thomas, without acknowledging that anything had changed at all. She had been a different person once. Martha Brennan, before she married. The daughter of a schoolteacher in Fort Smith, Arkansas, who had taught her to read before she was 5 and filled their small house with books borrowed from anyone who would lend them. She'd grown up on stories of faraway places and impossible adventures, had dreamed of seeing the ocean someday, of traveling east to the great cities her father described from his youth. She'd married Thomas Colvin when she was 19, a kind man with gentle hands and a laugh that came easily, who owned a dry goods store in a settlement called Gaines Creek, about 40 miles southeast of where she now hid. They had a good life together, simple but satisfying. A small house with a garden where she grew tomatoes and beans and herbs for cooking. Friends who visited on Sundays after church, bringing pies and gossip and laughter. Plans for children someday when the store was more established. When they'd saved enough to add a room to the house, then the fever came. It swept through Gaines Creek like wildfire in late summer, killing indiscriminately. Old and young, strong and weak, healthy and frail. No one knew where it came from. Some said a trader who'd passed through from the east. Others blamed the water or the heat or God's judgment. Thomas got sick first, complaining of a headache one morning, burning with fever by afternoon. 3 days later, he was gone. Martha had held his hand as he died, felt the life drain out of him degree by degree, watched the light fade from his eyes, and something inside her broke so completely she didn't know how to put it back together. Didn't know if there was even anything left to repair. After the funeral, she tried to keep going. Tried to run the store, standing behind the counter where Thomas had stood, measuring out flour and sugar and coffee with shaking hands. Tried to maintain the house, sweeping floors and washing dishes and making a bed she could no longer bear to sleep in. Tried to be the woman she'd been before, the woman who smiled and chatted with customers and maintained the pleasant fiction that life would somehow continue. But the grief was too heavy. It pressed down on her chest until she couldn't breathe, until every breath felt like an act of betrayal. How dare she keep breathing when Thomas couldn't? How dare she keep living when he was in the ground? The townspeople meant well, bringing casseroles and offering prayers, sitting with her in her parlor and telling her that time heals all wounds, that God has a plan, that Thomas was in a better place now. Their words felt hollow, their pity suffocating. She could see it in their eyes when they looked at her, that mixture of sympathy and relief that it was her husband who died and not theirs. Could hear the whispers when they thought she wasn't listening, wondering how long before she'd need to sell the store, whether she'd move back to Fort Smith with her father, if she'd ever marry again one night. About 2 months after the funeral, she walked out of town and didn't come back. She'd left everything behind. The store, the house, the carefully maintained grave with Thomas's name carved in wood, because they couldn't afford stone. She took only what she wore and a small bundle of food that wouldn't last more than a few days. She'd wandered for days, maybe weeks, moving deeper into the wilderness without purpose or direction, sleeping under trees, drinking from streams, eating whatever she could find that looked remotely edible. When she found the cave, it felt like an answer. A place to hide. A place where no one would look at her with sad eyes or tell her that time heals all wounds, or expect her to be anything other than broken. That had been months ago. Maybe longer. She'd lost track. The seasons had changed, summer's heat giving way to autumn's cooler days. And she'd watched it happen from her cave like watching a play through a window. Distant and unreal, now standing at the cave entrance. Martha tried to summon the will to venture out. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a sharp pain that made her double over slightly, but the thought of walking down to the creek, of being exposed and vulnerable in the open air, made her heart race with panic. What if someone saw her? What if they tried to take her back? She couldn't face those pitying looks again. Couldn't face the questions or the expectations or the unbearable weight of other people's concern. Out here, alone, she didn't have to pretend. Didn't have to be strong or brave or hopeful. She could just exist, day by day, moment by moment. Until one day she wouldn't exist anymore, and that would be fine too. She retreated into the cave shadows, pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping her thin arms around them. Just a little longer, she told herself. Just a little more time alone, and maybe the pain would finally stop. Maybe she'd stop seeing Thomas's face every time she closed her eyes, stop hearing his voice in the wind, stop reaching for him in the moments between sleep and waking only to remember all over again that he was gone. But pain, she was learning, didn't stop. It just changed shape, transformed from the sharp agony of fresh loss into a dull, constant ache that colored everything gray. Molly moved through the forest with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been tracking game since childhood. He was 26 years old, lean and strong, with dark eyes that missed nothing and black hair that fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt dyed deep blue, a knife at his belt and a rifle slung across his back. His people, the Choctaw, had lived in these mountains for generations before the white men came, and even after removal had scattered many to distant territories. Some families remained, adapting, surviving, finding ways to keep their traditions alive in a world that seemed determined to erase them. He was hunting deer, following tracks that led up into the rocky hills west of his family's land. The tracks were fresh, maybe an hour old, pressed deep into the soft earth near a stream, and the wind was in his favor, blowing from the deer toward him rather than the other way around. He moved carefully, stepping over fallen branches, avoiding dry leaves that might crackle and give away his position. His father had taught him to hunt like this when he was a boy, to read the forest like a language, to become part of it rather than an intruder, to understand that everything in the wilderness was connected, predator and prey, hunter and hunted, all part of the same eternal dance. The tracks led him higher, up a steep slope covered in loose shale and scrub brush that grabbed at his leggings. He paused at the top, scanning the valley below, his eyes moving in the methodical pattern his father had taught him. Left to right, near to far, looking for movement, for the flick of a white tail or the brown shape of a body against the trees. No sign of the deer, but something else caught his attention. A thin wisp of smoke rising from somewhere on the opposite hillside, barely visible against the blue sky. The kind of smoke that came from a small fire, carefully tended. He frowned. There were no settlements this far out. No homesteads or camps that he knew of, and he knew these mountains better than most. His family's land bordered the wilderness, and he'd spent his whole life exploring these hills and valleys, knew where every spring and cave and game trail could be found. Could be a drifter, maybe, someone passing through on their way to somewhere else. Or a trapper setting up for the season. Or it could be trouble. In these mountains, you learn to investigate things that didn't belong, because ignoring them could mean danger for your family, your neighbors, your people. Molly changed direction, moving toward the smoke with the same careful attention he'd used tracking the deer. It took him half an hour to circle around and approach from above, using the terrain to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree, pausing often to listen. As he got closer, he realized the smoke wasn't from a campfire. It was coming from a crack in the rocks, barely visible through the vegetation, the kind of thin, careful smoke someone made when they didn't want to be seen. He slowed his approach, every sense alert. Someone was living here, hidden away in these hills. The question was why? Settlers running from debts? Outlaws hiding from the law? Someone sick or injured with nowhere else to go? Or something else entirely, something he couldn't yet imagine. He found the cave entrance easily enough once he knew where to look. The vines had been pushed aside recently, their stems bent and broken, and there were faint tracks in the dirt near the opening. Small tracks, barefoot, a woman or a child, someone light enough that their prints barely registered in the harder ground. Molly crouched at the entrance, peering inside. The interior was dim, his eyes needing time to adjust after the brightness of the afternoon sun, but he could make out a figure huddled against the far wall. His hand moved instinctively to his knife, not drawing it but ready, because even wounded animals could be dangerous when cornered. But whoever was in there didn't look like a threat. Didn't look like much of anything, really, just a small shape pressed into the shadows like they were trying to disappear. "Hello," he called out in English, keeping his voice calm and low, the tone he'd use with a spooked horse. "I don't mean you any harm." The figure flinched, pressing further into the shadows, and he could hear quick, panicked breathing. the kind that came before screaming or running. He tried again in Choctaw, then in English once more, speaking slowly and clearly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to know if you're all right. If you need help." Silence. Then, a voice, barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "Go away," a woman's voice. Rough and unused, cracked like she hadn't spoken to another person in a very long time. But definitely a woman. Molly stayed where he was, not moving closer, not making any gesture that might be seen as threatening. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" I said. "Go away." Louder this time, edged with fear and something else. Desperation maybe, or anger, or both. He could force the issue, could go in and drag her out if he wanted to. He was bigger, stronger, armed. But something about the raw terror in her voice stopped him. This wasn't a criminal hiding from the law. This wasn't someone who'd done wrong and was paying for it. This was someone who'd been broken, someone who'd crawled into this hole to die and didn't want to be disturbed in the process. "All right," Molly said quietly, his tone gentle but firm. "I'm leaving. But I'm going to come back tomorrow. I'll bring food and water. You don't have to talk to me, don't have to show yourself, but you should eat. You need to eat." He didn't wait for a response. He backed away from the entrance, giving her space, giving her the dignity of not being stared at, and made his way down the hillside, moving carefully through the rocks and brush. Behind him, in the darkness of the cave, Martha Colvin sat trembling, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst, her hands shaking as she pressed them against her chest. Someone had found her. After all this time, after all these months of careful hiding, someone had found her. The knowledge filled her with terror, but also, and this surprised her, with something that might have been relief. Molly returned the next morning, just as he'd promised. The sun was barely above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and the air carried the crisp bite of autumn. He brought cornbread wrapped in cloth, still warm from his mother's oven, dried venison that had been smoked and salted for preservation, a small jar of honey, and a canteen of fresh water drawn from the spring behind his family's cabin. He set them just inside the cave entrance, far enough and that rain wouldn't reach them, but not so far that he'd intrude on her space, not so far that she'd feel threatened by his presence. "I'm leaving food," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "It's just inside. Take it or don't, but it's there if you need it." He left without waiting for an answer, without trying to catch a glimpse of her, respecting the boundary she'd drawn, even if he didn't fully understand it. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time, the food from the previous day was gone, the cloth folded neatly, the canteen empty and placed carefully where he'd left it. She was eating. That was something. That was progress, even if it was small, even if it was just the bare minimum of survival. On the fourth day, he brought a blanket. Winter was coming to the mountains, and the nights were getting cold, the temperature dropping enough that frost formed on the ground in the mornings and his breath misted in the air. He'd taken the blanket from his own bed, a thick wool weave in shades of red and black that his grandmother had made years ago. He folded it carefully and placed it with the food, running his hand over the familiar texture one last time before stepping back. "There's a blanket here," he said to the darkness inside the cave. "Nights are going to get colder. You'll need it to stay warm." This time, a voice answered, so quiet he almost missed it. "Why are you doing this?" Molly paused, considering his words carefully, knowing that whatever he said next might determine whether she stayed or fled deeper into the wilderness. "Because you need help. And because no one should have to live like this, alone in the cold and dark. You don't know anything about me." "I know you're alone," Molly said, his voice steady and honest. "I know you're scared. And I know you're hurting. That's enough for me to care." Silence again, stretching out between them like a physical thing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, barely more than a breath. "Thank you," It was a start, the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. A week passed. Molly continued his daily visits, establishing a routine that became as natural as checking his trap lines or tending to his family's horses. He brought food, water, sometimes other small things that he thought might help. A bar of soap that smelled of lavender, made by a woman in the nearest settlement who traded herbs for goods. A comb carved from bone, simple but functional. A tin cup with a handle, easier to drink from than the canteen. He never pushed, never demanded she show herself or speak to him. He simply left what he brought and spoke a few words before leaving. Always the same gentle tone, always respectful of her space. His mother asked questions. Ayanna was a perceptive woman who'd raised 5 children and buried 2, who knew her son's heart better than he knew it himself sometimes. "You've been going into the hills every morning," she said one evening as they prepared dinner together in the cabin she shared with Molly and his younger sister. "Not hunting. You never bring back game anymore." Molly chopped wild onions with careful precision, keeping his eyes on his work. "I found someone who needs help." "What kind of someone?" "A woman. White, living in a cave like an animal. Half-starved and scared of her own shadow." Ayanna stopped stirring the pot over the fire, turning to look at her son with dark eyes that saw too much. "And you're feeding her?" "Yes. Why?" Molly set down the knife and met his mother's gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because she's suffering and I can help." "Isn't that what you taught me?" Ayanna studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your father would have done the same thing. He never could walk past someone in need." She paused, her expression softening. "But be careful, my son. Broken things sometimes cut the hands that try to mend them." "I know." Ayanna turned back to the pot, adding herbs from bundles that hung from the ceiling beams. "When you lost Talula and the baby, you were broken too. You hid it better than this woman hides in her cave, but you were just as lost. Maybe that's why you recognize it in her." Molly didn't answer, but his mother was right. He knew what it was to feel like the world had ended, to wake up every morning and wonder why he was still breathing when the people he loved were gone. Talula had been his wife for only 2 years when the complications of childbirth took her and their son in the same terrible night. He'd buried them together in the plot behind the cabin, beneath an oak tree that his father had planted when Molly was born. And for months afterward he'd moved through life like a ghost, doing what needed to be done, but feeling nothing, caring about nothing. His mother had brought him back, slowly and patiently, refusing to let him disappear into his grief. Maybe he could do the same for this woman in the cave, on the 8th day. When he arrived at the cave entrance with his usual offerings, she was sitting just inside, visible for the first time in the morning light that slanted through the opening. Molly stopped several feet away, careful not to startle her, careful to keep his posture non-threatening. In the clear light, he could see her fully now, and what he saw made his chest tighten with a mixture of pity and anger. She was thin, dangerously so, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and inadequate food. Her hair was a tangled mess of brown shot through with premature gray, matted in places where it had gone too long without washing or combing. Her dress hung on her like a shroud, torn and filthy, barely recognizable as clothing. But it was her eyes that struck him most, empty and haunted. Like she'd seen something that had stolen her soul and left only the shell behind. They looked at each other for a long moment, neither speaking, both taking measure of the other. Molly could see her trembling slightly, could see the way her hands gripped her knees, ready to bolt back into the darkness if he made any wrong move. Finally, Molly set down the bundle he'd brought, moving slowly and deliberately, and stepped back to give her space. "My name is Molly," he said, his voice gentle. "What's yours?" She hesitated, as if she'd forgotten, as if the name belonged to someone she used to be rather than who she was now. "Martha," she said at last, her voice rough and unused. "Martha Colvin, it's good to meet you." Martha, she didn't respond to that, just stared at him with those hollow eyes, studying his face, his clothes, his hands, as if trying to determine what kind of threat he might pose. "How long have you been out here?" Molly asked, keeping his tone conversational, non-judgmental. "I don't know. Months, maybe. I stopped counting. Where did you come from?" Gaines Creek. Her voice was flat, emotionless, like she was reporting facts that had nothing to do with her. "My husband died. I couldn't stay. Couldn't face them all looking at me like I was something broken that needed fixing." Molly nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said, hearing the pain beneath the words even if her voice tried to hide it. "You can't stay here either. Winter's coming. You'll freeze when the real cold hits. I don't care." The words were said without emotion, without drama, just a simple statement of fact that hit him harder than if she'd screamed them. "Maybe not," Molly said carefully. "But I do. And I'm not going to stop coming here just because you've decided to give up." Martha looked away, her jaw tight, her hands clenching and unclenching on her knees. "I didn't ask for your help. Didn't ask for you to find me or bring me food or care what happens to me." "No," Molly agreed, crouching down slowly to bring himself to her level, careful to maintain distance. "But you're getting it anyway. That's what people do. They help each other. Not where I'm from." "Then you were living in the wrong place." He settled more comfortably into his crouch, showing he wasn't in a hurry, wasn't going to rush her or push her. "Listen to me, Martha. Whatever happened to you, whatever you're running from, staying out here alone isn't the answer. You're wasting away. In another month, maybe less, you'll be too weak to even leave this cave. Too weak to gather food or water. And then what? Good." The word hit him like a physical blow. She meant it. She wanted to die out here, wanted to simply fade away until there was nothing left. "I lost someone too," Molly said quietly, deciding to share something he rarely talked about. "My wife, 3 years ago, childbirth. The baby didn't make it either." "A son." Martha's eyes flickered toward him. The first real emotion he'd seen there, a recognition of shared pain. "I know what it's like," Molly continued, his voice low and honest. "To feel like the world ended and you're the only one who noticed. To want to crawl into the ground and never come back up. To wonder why you're still breathing when they're not. I spent months wishing I died instead of them, wishing I could trade places. Wishing for anything except the reality I was living in. Then you understand why I need to stay here." "No," Molly said firmly, shaking his head. "I understand why you want to. But wanting to die and actually dying are two different things. And I'm not going to stand by and watch you do this to yourself. I'm not going to let you waste away in this cave when there's another path forward. You can't stop me." "Maybe not," Molly acknowledged. "But I can keep bringing you food. Keep checking on you. Keep reminding you that someone in this world gives a damn whether you live or die. And maybe, eventually, you'll start to care too." Martha's face crumpled, the careful blankness she'd maintained shattering like glass. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dirt and grime, and once they started, they didn't stop. Great, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Sounds that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside her. All the grief and pain and loss she'd been holding back for months, coming out in a flood she couldn't control. Molly didn't move closer, didn't try to comfort her physically. He understood instinctively that she needed space. That touch right now might feel like violation rather than comfort. He just stayed where he was, a quiet presence, solid and unchanging, and let her break apart, knowing someone was there to witness it. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her exhausted and shaking, Martha wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her cheeks. "I don't know how to come back," she whispered, her voice raw. "I don't know how to be a person again. Don't know how to care about anything or want anything or be anything except this. One step at a time, Molly said gently. That's all any of us can do. You don't have to figure out the whole path right now. Just the next step. Then the one after that. He stood slowly, his joints protesting slightly, and picked up the empty canteen from yesterday. I'll be back tomorrow. And the day after that. For as long as it takes. However long you need. He turned to leave, then paused at the cave entrance, looking back at her. You don't have to do this alone, Martha. You never did. That's what you've forgotten. But I'll keep reminding you until you remember. As he walked away down the hillside, Martha sat in the cave entrance, watching him disappear into the forest. His figure growing smaller until the trees swallowed him completely. For the first time in months, something stirred inside her chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope felt too big, too dangerous, too likely to be disappointed. But maybe something smaller.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Maybe just the faintest possibility that she didn't have to stay buried forever. Maybe just a recognition that someone saw her, really saw her, not as an object of pity, but as a person worth saving. Maybe that was enough to start. Maybe that was the first step Molly had talked about. Over the next week, their conversations grew longer. Molly would arrive with food and supplies, and Martha would be waiting near the entrance, still wary, still ready to retreat, but willing to talk. He told her about his family, his mother Ayana and his younger sister Nita, who was learning to weave baskets in the traditional way. He talked about his father who died 5 years ago, about the land they lived on and the changes that had come to it. He spoke of his wife Talila in halting sentences, sharing memories that still hurt, but that he wanted to honor by speaking aloud. Martha listened, saying little at first, but gradually she began to share her own story. She talked about Thomas, about their life in Gaines Creek, about the fever that had taken him and the emptiness that had consumed her afterward. She described the suffocating pity of her neighbors, the unbearable weight of their expectations, the way she'd felt like she was drowning even as everyone told her to keep swimming. They meant well, she said one afternoon, sitting with her knees drawn up, the blanket Molly had brought wrapped around her shoulders. But they didn't understand. They thought time would heal it, that I just needed to get through the first year and then everything would be better. But it wasn't better. It was just different. The sharp pain turned into this dull ache that never went away. It doesn't go away, Molly said, sitting a respectful distance from her on a flat rock near the cave entrance. Not completely. You just learn to carry it. Learn to live with it instead of being crushed by it. How? By not doing it alone. By letting people help you carry the weight. He looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. That's what you need to understand, Martha. You're not weak for needing help. You're not a failure because you couldn't bear this grief by yourself. No one can. We're not meant to. Martha pulled the blanket tighter around herself, looking out at the forest beyond the cave. I thought if I came out here, if I got away from all of them, the pain would stop. Or at least I'd stop having to pretend it didn't hurt. And did it work? She laughed, a bitter sound without humor. No, it just meant I was alone with it. And somehow that was worse. On the 10th day, Molly brought his mother with him. He'd warned Martha the day before, had asked permission rather than simply showing up with another person, and she'd agreed with visible reluctance. Ayana came bearing gifts, a clean dress that had belonged to her when she was younger, a proper brush for Martha's hair, and herbs for washing. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with gray threading through her black hair and a face that showed both strength and kindness. "Hello, Martha," Ayana said in careful English. Her accent thick, but her words clear. "My son tells me you've been living out here alone. That must have been very hard." Martha nodded. Suddenly shy in the presence of another woman, acutely aware of how she must look, how she must smell after months of inadequate bathing. Ayanna seemed to understand. "There's a hot spring not far from here," she said gently. "Maybe half a mile down the valley. The water is warm even in winter, and it's very private. Would you like to go there? I'll show you the way, and you can wash properly. Take your time." Martha looked at Molly, then back at his mother, uncertainty written across her face. You don't have to," Ayanna said quickly. "But you might feel better if you do. Sometimes caring for our bodies helps us care for our spirits." After a long moment, Martha nodded. All right, the hot spring was everything Ayanna had promised. A natural pool fed by heated water that bubbled up from deep in the earth, surrounded by rocks and overhanging trees that provided privacy. Ayanna showed Martha the spot, handed her the soap and the clean dress, then retreated to give her space. "I'll be just over there," she said, pointing to a cluster of rocks about 50 feet away. "Take as long as you need." Martha undressed slowly, her hands shaking slightly, and stepped into the water. It was almost too hot at first, making her skin tingle and flush, but as she settled in, the heat began to work its way into her muscles, loosening tension she'd been carrying for so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be relaxed. She dunked her head under, came up gasping, and began to work the soap through her tangled hair. It took a long time to feel clean. The water around her turned gray with dirt, and she had to move to a different part of the pool to rinse properly. But gradually, methodically, she washed away months of grime and neglect, scrubbing her skin until it was pink and raw, working the tangles out of her hair with patient fingers. When she finally emerged and put on the clean dress Ayanna had brought, she felt like a different person. Not the person she'd been before Thomas died, but not the creature that had been living in the cave either. Something in between. Something new. When she rejoined Ayanna, the older woman smiled with genuine warmth. "Better, yes," Martha said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Thank you." They walked back to the cave together, Ayanna talking easily about her family, about the settlement where they lived, about the autumn harvest that was coming. She didn't pry, didn't ask invasive questions, just offered companionship and conversation like it was the most natural thing in the world. By the time they reached the cave, Martha realized she was smiling, just a little, at something Ayanna had said about her daughter's stubborn streak. Molly was waiting there, and when he saw Martha, clean and dressed properly, something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe. Or hope. "You look better," he said simply. "I feel better," Martha admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. That night, for the first time in months, Martha slept deeply, wrapped in the blanket Molly had brought, clean and fed and no longer quite so alone. The following morning brought a cold snap that turned the air sharp and biting. Martha woke shivering despite the blanket, her breath misting in the dim light of the cave. She lay there for a moment, feeling the ache in her bones from sleeping on stone, and realized with sudden clarity that she couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't spend another winter hiding in this hole, waiting to fade away. Something had shifted yesterday. In the hot spring, in the simple act of being clean, in the kindness of strangers who ask nothing in return. When Molly arrived with food that morning, she was already at the cave entrance, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. "I want to leave," she said without preamble, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. "I can't stay here anymore. But I don't know where to go." Molly set down the bundle he'd brought, his expression carefully neutral. "You could come to our settlement. We have room. My mother already suggested it. I can't impose like that. You've already done too much. It's not imposing if we're offering," Molly said firmly. "And winter's coming fast. Another week, maybe 2, and these mountains will be dangerous. Snow gets deep up here, and you're not equipped to survive it." Martha looked down at her hands, at the dress Ayanna had given her, at the evidence of kindness that surrounded her. What would I do there? I have no money, no skills worth trading. I'd just be another mouth to feed. You'd find your place, Molly said with quiet confidence. Everyone does. My mother could use help with her weaving. The settlement always needs teachers for the children. You said your father was a school teacher. Maybe you could do the same. The idea of teaching, of being useful again, sparked something in Martha's chest. Not quite hope, but close. Interest, maybe, possibility. I don't know if I remember how. Then you'll learn again, Molly said simply. Just like you're learning to come back to life. One step at a time. Martha took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. Feeling the fear and resistance that had kept her in this cave for months, warring with the desperate need to be part of the world again. All right, she said finally, the words barely above a whisper. I'll come with you. Molly's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him. Good, gather what you have. We'll leave today while the weather holds. Martha looked around the cave that had been her refuge and her prison. There was nothing to gather, really. The few possessions she'd brought with her months ago had been lost or abandoned or worn to nothing. All she had was the dress on her back and the blanket around her shoulders. It seemed fitting somehow. She was leaving this place as empty-handed as she'd arrived, but not as empty-hearted. The walk down from the hills took most of the morning. Martha's legs were weak from months of inadequate food and limited movement, and she had to stop frequently to catch her breath. Molly never rushed her, never showed impatience. He simply waited when she needed to rest, pointing out landmarks, talking about the land they were crossing. He showed her where the best persimmon trees grew, where a family of foxes had their den, where his father used to take him fishing in the creek that ran through the valley. You know these mountains well, Martha observed during one of their rest stops, sitting on a fallen log while her legs stopped trembling. I was born here, Molly said, leaning against a tree trunk. My father's father was born here too, before the government tried to move us all west. Some families went. Some stayed and learned to be invisible, to live in the spaces the white settlers didn't want. These mountains protected us. It must be hard, Martha said quietly, watching your land get carved up and claimed by others. Molly shrugged, but his eyes were serious. It's hard watching anything you love get taken away. But land endures. People endure. We're still here, even if the world tried to erase us. Martha understood that in a way she couldn't have before. She'd tried to erase herself, to disappear into the wilderness and let the world forget she'd ever existed. But here she was, still breathing, still walking, still capable of starting over even when everything felt lost. By midday, they reached the settlement. It wasn't much, a cluster of cabins and structures scattered across a valley where a creek ran clear and cold. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Martha could hear voices. The sound of an axe splitting wood, dogs barking, children laughing. Normal sounds. Living sounds. They made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Molly's cabin sat slightly apart from the others, a sturdy structure of logs and stone with a covered porch and a garden plot that had been put to bed for winter. Ayanna emerged as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron, her face breaking into a warm smile when she saw Martha. You came, she said, as if there had been any doubt. Good. Come inside. You must be exhausted. The interior of the cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and cooking food. One large room served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and sleeping areas partitioned off with hanging blankets. It was simple but comfortable, showing the care of people who made the most of what they had. Nita, Molly's younger sister, looked up from where she was working on a basket. Her dark eyes curious but not unkind. This is Martha, Ayanna said to her daughter in Choctaw, then switched to English for Martha's benefit. She'll be staying with us for a while, Nita nodded, setting aside her basket work and standing to offer a shy smile. She was perhaps 16, with her mother's handsome features and her brother's thoughtful eyes. "Hello," she said in careful English. "Welcome, thank you," Martha managed, suddenly overwhelmed by the warmth of the cabin, the kindness of these strangers, the sheer normalcy of being inside a home again. Her eyes burned with unexpected tears. Ayanna seemed to understand. She guided Martha to a chair near the fire and pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. "Sit, rest. You've come a long way." Martha sat, her hands wrapped around the cup, feeling the heat seep into her cold fingers. She watched as Ayanna moved around the kitchen, preparing food with practiced efficiency, while Nita returned to her basket weaving and Molly brought in firewood from outside. It was domestic and peaceful, the kind of ordinary family scene she'd thought she'd never be part of again. Over the next few days, Martha began to find her place in the household. She helped Ayanna with cooking and cleaning, relearning skills she'd let atrophy during her months in the cave. Her hands were clumsy at first, dropping things, forgetting steps and recipes she'd once known by heart. But Ayanna was patient, guiding her gently, never making her feel foolish or inadequate. She also began to venture out into the settlement, at first just to the creek to fetch water, then gradually farther. The people she met were kind but reserved, greeting her politely but keeping their distance. She understood why. She was an outsider, a white woman in a community that had learned to be wary of white people. She would have to earn their trust. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Martha was sitting on the cabin porch mending a tear in one of Molly's shirts when a woman approached. She was younger than Martha, perhaps in her late 20s, with a baby strapped to her back in a cradleboard and a small child clinging to her skirt. "You are the woman from the cave," she said in halting English. "Molly's mother says you were a teacher." "My father was a teacher," Martha corrected gently. "I helped him sometimes, but I've never taught on my own." The woman nodded, considering this. "My son needs to learn English. The traders, they only speak English. He needs to know it to help our family. Could you teach him?" Martha looked at the little boy, who was perhaps 5 years old, peeking out from behind his mother's skirt with wide, curious eyes. "I could try," she said slowly. "I'm not sure I'd be very good at it." "You know more than we do," the woman said pragmatically. "That is enough." And so Martha became a teacher, starting with one child and gradually accumulating more as word spread that she was willing to instruct the settlement's children in English and arithmetic and reading. She held lessons in the mornings on Ayanna's porch when the weather was mild, and inside by the fire when it wasn't. She had no books at first, so she drew letters in the dirt with a stick, made up stories to illustrate grammar, taught counting using stones and acorns. The children were quick learners, bright and eager, and teaching them gave Martha something she'd been missing for months: purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning, a sense that she was contributing something of value rather than just taking up space in the world. Molly watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. He'd returned from hunting or working in the fields to find Martha surrounded by children, her voice clear and patient as she explained some concept or corrected some mistake. The hollow look in her eyes was fading, replaced by something brighter. Not happiness, not yet, but engagement, interest, life. One evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Ayanna working on her weaving while Nita practiced songs in Choctaw and Martha mended clothes, Molly spoke up. "You're good with the children," he said to Martha. "They've learned more in 2 weeks than they did in 6 months with the missionary who used to come through." Martha looked up from her mending, surprised. "I'm just doing what I can. Your mother has done far more for me. You're giving back," Ayanna said, without looking up from her loom. "That's important. Not for us, but for you. A person needs to feel useful." "I do feel useful," Martha admitted, the words coming slowly as she examined her own feelings. "For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Like I'm a person again, instead of just a ghost going through the motions. You were always a person, Molly said firmly. You just forgot for a while. Winter arrived in earnest in late November, bringing snow that blanketed the valley and turned the world quiet and white. Martha had never experienced a mountain winter before, had never known cold that bit through layers of clothing and made the air hurt to breathe. But the cabin was warm, and she was never alone. Ayanna taught her to weave baskets in the Choctaw style, showed her which herbs to use for medicine and cooking, shared the stories and traditions that had been passed down through generations. In return, Martha taught Ayanna and Nita to read English, writing lessons on a precious piece of slate that Molly had traded for her at a settlement 2 valleys over. Nita proved to be a quick study, picking up letters and words with the same ease she showed in basket weaving. Ayanna was slower but determined, practicing her letters by the firelight long after everyone else had gone to bed. "Why is it so important to you?" Martha asked one night, watching Ayanna struggle with a particularly difficult word. Ayanna looked up, her eyes serious in the flickering firelight. "Because the world is changing," she said quietly. "The old ways, they're still important, still worth preserving. But the new ways, the white man's ways, they're not going away. My children need to know both to survive. Need to walk in both worlds," Martha understood. It was the same reason the settlement's parents sent their children to her lessons, the same reason they worked so hard to adapt without losing themselves. Survival required flexibility, required learning new skills while holding onto the core of who you were. As the weeks passed and winter deepened, Martha found herself settling into a rhythm that felt almost like contentment. She rose with the sun to help Ayanna prepare breakfast, taught her morning lessons to children bundled in furs and blankets, spent afternoons learning traditional crafts or helping with household tasks, and evenings gathered around the fire sharing stories. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't anything like what she'd had with Thomas, but it was a life. It was real and present and worth living. One particularly cold afternoon in January, Molly returned from checking his trap lines to find Martha alone in the cabin, Ayanna and Nita having gone to visit a sick neighbor. She was sitting by the fire working on a basket, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she wove the willow strips in the pattern Ayanna had taught her. She looked up when he entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Any luck?" she asked, setting aside her work. "2 rabbits and a fox," Molly said, showing her the pelts. "Good furs. I can trade them for supplies we need." He hung the pelts to dry and joined her by the fire, warming his hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle. Then Molly spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You've changed since you came down from the mountain." "I hope so," Martha said with a slight smile. "I was barely alive up there. You're teaching, learning, becoming part of the community. That takes courage, or desperation," Martha said honestly. "I didn't have anywhere else to go. You could have stayed in the cave. Could have refused to try. But you didn't." Molly looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "That's courage, Martha. Don't dismiss it." Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "You and your mother saved my life. I owe you everything." "You don't owe us anything," Molly said firmly. "What we did because it was right. Because you needed help. Not because we expected something in return." "I know that," Martha said quietly. "That's what makes it mean so much." Another silence fell, but this one felt different. Charged somehow. Martha became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the way the firelight played across Molly's features, of the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. Her heart began to beat faster, and she recognized the feeling with a mixture of surprise and guilt, attraction, interest, things she hadn't felt since before Thomas died, things she wasn't sure she had any right to feel. Molly seemed to sense her discomfort. He stood, moving to add wood to the fire, giving her space. "I should start preparing dinner before my mother gets back," he said, his tone carefully casual. "She'd be upset if we haven't at least started." "I'll help," Martha said quickly, grateful for the distraction, for the return to normal friendly territory. But as they worked side by side, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, Martha couldn't quite shake the awareness that something had shifted between them. Something subtle but undeniable. And she didn't know whether to be frightened by it or grateful. That night, lying in her sleeping area behind the partition, listening to the quiet sounds of the household settling for sleep, Martha thought about Thomas. She hadn't thought about him, really thought about him, in weeks. The sharp pain of his loss had dulled to a manageable ache, present but no longer consuming. She wondered what he would think of where she was, of the life she was building with these generous strangers. Would he be angry that she was moving forward? Or would he be glad that she'd found a reason to keep living? She liked to think he'd be glad. Thomas had been a kind man, a generous man. He wouldn't have wanted her to waste away in a cave, wouldn't have wanted her to stop living just because he had. He would have wanted her to find joy again, even if it looked different than the joy they'd shared. The thought brought tears, but they were different than the tears she'd cried before. Not tears of despair or hopelessness, but tears of grief mixed with gratitude. Grief for what she'd lost, gratitude for what she'd found. Both could be true at the same time. Outside, the wind continued to howl and snow continued to fall, burying the world in white silence. But inside the cabin, surrounded by people who'd shown her that kindness existed even in the hardest places, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt safe. She felt seen. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she could build a life worth living after all. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges and new choices. But for now, in the deep cold of winter, wrapped in borrowed blankets in a borrowed home, Martha closed her eyes and slept peacefully, dreaming not of the past but of possibilities she hadn't dared imagine before. Spring arrived slowly in the Kiamichi Mountains, not with a single dramatic transformation, but with gradual shifts that accumulated over weeks. The snow began to melt first in patches where the sun hit strongest, revealing brown earth and last year's dead grass. Ice broke apart in the creek with sounds like glass shattering, and the water ran fast and cold with snowmelt from higher elevations. Birds returned, their songs unfamiliar to Martha after months of winter silence. And the trees began to bud with the promise of leaves yet to come. Martha had been living with Molly's family for nearly 4 months now, and the settlement had become home in ways she hadn't expected. She knew the paths between cabins without thinking, recognized voices before seeing faces, understood the rhythms and routines that governed community life. The children she taught had progressed remarkably, several now able to read simple texts and write basic sentences. Their parents had begun bringing her small gifts in gratitude. Eggs from their chickens, vegetables from their root cellars. A pair of moccasins that fit her perfectly. But as winter's grip loosened and the world opened up again, Martha found herself thinking more often about what came next. She couldn't stay with Molly's family forever. Couldn't continue to sleep in a corner of their cabin and eat food they provided without contributing more substantially. She needed to find a way to truly support herself, to become independent rather than dependent. One morning in early April, as Martha was helping Ayana prepare breakfast, she voiced these thoughts. "I need to start thinking about my future," she said, grinding corn for Johnny cakes. "I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." Ayana looked up from where she was slicing salt pork, her expression unreadable. "You think you're imposing. I know I am," Martha said quietly. "You've been more than generous, but I need to find my own way. I just don't know what that looks like." Ayana set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. "Come sit," she said, gesturing to the table. When Martha complied, Ayana joined her, her dark eyes serious. You teach our children. You help with the work of the household. You've learned our ways and shown respect for our traditions. You're not imposing, Martha. You're contributing. You're part of this community now. But I'm not Choctaw, Martha said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. I'm white, an outsider. Surely people must resent me being here. Some do, Ayana admitted with characteristic honesty. Some will always see you as white first, as a person second. The wounds run deep, and trust is hard-earned. But many see what I see, a woman who was broken and found the strength to heal. A woman who gives back more than she takes. That matters more than the color of your skin. Martha felt her throat tighten with emotion.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Thank you, she managed. For everything. For taking me in, for teaching me, for treating me like family when I had nothing and no one. You would have done the same, Ayana said simply. I know this because you did do the same. You taught yourself to survive alone in that cave. You found the strength to come down when my son offered help. You rebuilt yourself piece by piece. That takes a kind of courage that has nothing to do with where you were born or what color your skin is. Before Martha could respond, the door opened and Molly entered, his hair windblown and his expression troubled. Mother, he said in Choctaw, then switched to English for Martha's benefit. Riders coming from the south. 3 of them white men. They'll be here within the hour. Ayana's expression hardened. Do you recognize them? No, but they're riding like they have purpose. Could be traitors, could be trouble. Martha felt her stomach clench with old fear. White men looking for someone. Could they be from Gaines Creek? Could someone have sent them looking for her? She'd been gone almost a year now. Surely no one cared enough to search for her anymore. Molly seemed to read her thoughts. Probably nothing to do with you, he said, but his eyes were watchful. Still, might be best if you stay inside when they arrive. Let me handle it, Martha nodded, hating the fear that crept back so easily. Hating that after months of feeling safe, she could be reduced to a trembling girl by the mere mention of strangers. The riders arrived just before noon. 3 rough-looking men on tired horses. Martha watched from the window as Molly met them at the edge of the settlement, his posture casual but his hand resting on the knife at his belt. She couldn't hear what was said, but she could see the lead rider doing most of the talking. Gesturing toward the cabins, toward the mountains beyond. After several minutes of conversation, Molly pointed toward one of the other cabins, and the riders moved in that direction. Molly returned to his own home, his expression thoughtful. They're looking for a woman, he said without preamble. White, brown hair thin, probably traveling alone. They say she's wanted for theft back in Fort Smith. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. I've never been to Fort Smith in my life, she said, her voice rising slightly. I mean, I lived there as a child, but I never stole anything. I know, Molly said calmly. I told them no one matching that description has come through here. They seem to believe me. What if they don't? Martha asked, panic creeping into her voice. What if they search the cabins? They won't, Molly said with quiet certainty. They're outnumbered here, and they know it. They'll ask their questions, maybe spend the night at one of the cabins if someone offers hospitality, then move on. They're looking for an easy catch, not a fight. But Martha couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her bones. She'd been running for so long, first from her grief, then from her past, and now she realized she'd been fooling herself thinking she could ever truly escape. The world beyond the settlement would always be there, always ready to pull her back. The riders did stay the night, accepting hospitality from a family on the far edge of the settlement. Martha stayed inside, helping Ayana with weaving and trying not to jump at every sound. Molly remained close to the cabin, visibly armed, sending a clear message to anyone watching. This household was protected. The next morning, the riders departed, heading north toward higher mountains. Martha watched them go from the window, her hands clutched together so tightly her knuckles turned white. Only when they disappeared completely did she allow herself to breathe normally. "They're gone," Molly said from behind her. "You're safe." "Am I?" Martha turned to face him. All the fear and uncertainty she'd been suppressing rising to the surface. "I thought I could stay here, could build a new life. But what if more riders come? What if someone from Gaines Creek recognizes me? What if I bring trouble to your family, to this community?" "Martha," Molly started, but she cut him off. "No, listen. I've been selfish, hiding here, pretending the outside world doesn't exist. But it does exist, and I can't keep running from it forever." Molly crossed the room and took her hands in his, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're not running anymore," he said firmly. "You're living. There's a difference. Those men weren't looking for you. They were looking for some criminal, someone who actually stole something. That's not you, but what if next time?" "Then we'll deal with it next time," Molly interrupted. "You can't live your life afraid of what might happen. You have to live for what is happening, for what's real right now." Martha stared at him, at the certainty in his eyes, at the strength in his hands holding hers. "When did you become so wise?" she asked, managing a weak smile. "My father used to say that wisdom is just experience that's been properly digested," Molly said, returning her smile. "I've had a lot of time to digest my experiences." He released her hands slowly, stepping back but keeping his eyes on hers. "You belong here, Martha. Not because you're running from something, but because this is where you've chosen to be. Where you've built connections and contributed and become part of something larger than yourself. Don't let fear take that away from you." Over the following weeks, as spring strengthened into early summer, Martha tried to embrace Molly's words. She threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy, expanding her lessons to include not just language and arithmetic, but geography and history. Drawing maps in the dirt to show the children where they lived in relation to the rest of the country. She helped Ayanna plant a garden, learning which crops grew best in mountain soil and how to protect tender seedlings from late frosts. She even began to explore the surrounding forest, at first staying close to the settlement, but gradually venturing farther, relearning the wilderness that had once terrified her. It was during one of these walks that she encountered Molly. About 2 miles from the settlement, near a place where the creek widened into a natural pool. He was fishing, his line cast into the still water, his posture relaxed. He looked up when she approached, a smile crossing his face. "Decided to brave the wilderness again," he said. "Decided I needed to stop being afraid of it," Martha corrected, settling onto a flat rock near where he stood. "The forest isn't my enemy. It never was. I made it into a prison, but that was my choice, not its nature." Molly nodded approvingly. "That's good thinking. The land is just the land. It's what we bring to it that makes it friend or foe." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the water, listening to birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice tentative. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Why did you help me?" Martha asked, the question that had been burning in her mind for months finally finding voice. "That first day, when you found me in the cave, you could have just walked away. Most people would have. But you came back, day after day, until I was ready to accept help." "Why?" Molly was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the water. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "When Talia died, when I lost them both, I wanted to die too. I didn't go live in a cave, but I might as well have. I stopped talking to people, stopped participating in the community, stopped caring about anything. My mother tried to reach me, but I pushed her away. I was drowning, and I was angry at everyone who wasn't drowning with me." He paused, reeling in his line and casting it again before continuing. "Then one day, an old man from the settlement came to see me. His name was Hakafo, which means listener in our language. He'd lost his own wife years before, and he just sat with me. Didn't say anything profound, didn't offer platitudes about time or God's plan. He just sat with me while I raged and cried and said terrible things. And then he came back the next day and the next, until I finally started listening instead of just yelling. Martha watched him, understanding dawning. And you were doing the same thing for me. I was paying forward what he did for me, Molly said simply. He showed me that grief doesn't have to be faced alone, that there's no shame in needing help to climb out of the dark. I wanted to show you the same thing. Did it work? Martha asked softly. Did you climb out? Eventually, Molly said. Not all at once, and not completely. I still miss them. Still wonder what my son would have looked like, what kind of man he would have become. But I learned to carry the grief instead of letting it carry me. Learned to honor their memory by living rather than by dying slowly. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. I'm trying to do that too, she whispered. Trying to honor Thomas by building something new rather than destroying myself. Some days it's easier than others. That's all any of us can do, Molly said, finally turning to look at her directly. Some days will be easier, some harder. But you're not alone in it anymore, Martha. That's the difference. Their eyes met and held, and Martha felt something pass between them, something warm and promising and terrifying all at once. She looked away first, her heart racing, unsure what to do with the feelings rising in her chest. Molly seemed to sense her confusion. He turned back to his fishing, giving her space to process. I caught 3 good-sized trout earlier, he said, his tone deliberately casual. If you help me carry them back, my mother will make that stew you like, Martha laughed, grateful for the shift back to safer ground. That sounds perfect, she said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. Lead the way, as they walked back to the settlement together, fish strung between them on a willow branch. Martha found herself acutely aware of Molly's presence beside her. The way he moved through the forest with unconscious grace, the way he pointed out plants and tracks and signs that she would have missed, the way his voice rumbled when he laughed at something she said. She was attracted to him, she realized with a start. Not just grateful for his help or appreciative of his kindness, but genuinely attracted to him as a man. The realization filled her with conflicting emotions. Guilt, because how could she feel this way about someone who wasn't Thomas? Fear, because what if she was just transferring her need for security onto the first man who'd shown her kindness? Confusion, because she didn't know if Molly felt the same way, or if she was reading too much into simple friendship. And underneath it all, a small flicker of something that might have been hope. That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Martha found herself watching Molly more closely. The way he interacted with his mother and sister, treating them with respect and affection. The way he spoke about the settlement's concerns, showing leadership without arrogance. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. And the way those eyes sometimes found hers across the room after dinner. As they sat around the fire and Nita practiced her English reading, Ayanna pulled Martha aside. "Walk with me," she said, not making it a question. They stepped outside into the cool evening air. Walking slowly toward the edge of the settlement where they could see the valley spread below them, darkening as night fell. For a while, neither spoke. Then Ayanna said, "My son cares for you." Martha's heart skipped. "He cares for everyone," she said carefully. "He's a good man." "He is," Ayanna agreed. "But the way he looks at you is different from how he looks at others. I've seen it growing these past months. Seen the way he finds excuses to be near you, the way he listens when you speak. He cares for you as a man cares for a woman, not just as a friend helps a friend." Martha didn't know what to say. "I don't know if I'm ready," she finally whispered. "Thomas hasn't been gone that long, and I still miss him. I don't know if what I feel is real, or just gratitude or loneliness. Only you can answer that," Ayanna said gently. "But I'll tell you what I told Molly when he lost Talila. The heart has room for many loves, and loving again doesn't diminish what came before. Your husband would want you to be happy, just as Molly's wife would want him to find joy again. The question isn't whether you have permission to feel what you feel. The question is whether you're brave enough to act on it. Martha looked out at the darkening valley, at the settlement lights beginning to glow in cabin windows, at the life she'd built here against all odds. "I don't know if I'm brave enough," she admitted. "You lived alone in a cave for months," Ayanna said with a slight smile. "You dragged yourself back from the edge of death. You learned a new way of life in a community not your own. You're braver than you think, Martha Colvin. The question is whether you'll be brave enough to let yourself be happy." As they walked back to the cabin, Martha turned Ayanna's words over in her mind. Could she let herself be happy? Could she open her heart to the possibility of love again, knowing how much it hurt to lose it? Could she trust that what she felt for Molly was real and not just a response to his kindness? She didn't have answers yet. But for the first time since Thomas died, she was willing to ask the questions. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. Summer arrived in full force, transforming the Kiamichi Mountains into a landscape of deep greens and brilliant wildflowers. The days stretched long and hot, and the settlement bustled with activity as everyone worked to take advantage of the growing season. Fields needed tending, animals required constant care, and preparations for the next winter began almost as soon as the last snow melted. Martha threw herself into the work, finding satisfaction in physical labor that left her too tired to overthink the complicated feelings growing in her chest. She'd been at the settlement for 6 months now, and the changes in her were remarkable. The hollow-cheeked, haunted woman who'd emerged from the cave had been replaced by someone stronger, healthier, more alive. Her hair had grown long enough to braid properly, and the sun had brought color back to her skin. She'd gained weight, her dresses fitting properly now instead of hanging like sacks. But the most significant changes were internal, in the way she carried herself with growing confidence, in the way she met people's eyes when she spoke, in the way she allowed herself to laugh without feeling guilty. Her teaching had expanded beyond simple language lessons. Several of the settlement's elders had approached her about documenting their stories, worried that traditional knowledge would be lost as the younger generation became more integrated with white society. Martha had agreed eagerly, spending her afternoons sitting with old men and women who spoke in Choctaw while Ayanna translated, recording their memories and histories in careful script on precious paper that Molly had acquired through trading. It was important work, meaningful work, and Martha felt honored to be trusted with it. She learned about the removal, about the families torn apart, and the people who died on the trail west. She learned about resistance and adaptation, about holding on to identity in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate. She learned about grief that spanned generations, about trauma passed down like heirlooms, about the strength required to survive when the world wanted you erased. The work changed her understanding of her own grief. What she'd experienced with Thomas's death was real and devastating, but it was also individual, personal. The grief these people carried was collective, woven into the fabric of their community, affecting not just individuals, but entire ways of life. It gave her perspective, helped her see that suffering came in many forms, and that healing was always possible, even when the wounds ran deep. One particularly hot afternoon in July, Martha was working in the garden when a commotion erupted at the edge of the settlement. She straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead, and saw a small group gathering near the main path. Molly was among them, speaking to a man she didn't recognize, someone travel-worn and dusty. Even from a distance, she could sense tension in the air. Ayanna appeared beside her, shading her eyes against the sun. "Trouble," she said quietly. "What kind?" "The kind that was always going to come eventually." Ayanna's expression was grim. "That's a land agent from the territorial government. They've been buying up properties, pushing people out." We knew they'd reach us eventually. Martha's stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means decisions need to be made, Ayana said, already moving toward the gathering. Come, you should hear this too. By the time they arrived, most of the settlement had congregated. The land agent, a thin man with a prominent Adam's apple and eyes that didn't quite meet anyone's gaze, was explaining something about surveys and claims and legal proceedings. His words were filled with bureaucratic language that obscured more than it revealed, but the message was clear enough. The government wanted this land, and the people living on it had limited options. You have 6 months to file proper claims, the agent was saying, consulting papers he'd pulled from his saddlebag. Under the Dawes Act, individual families can allotments. Those who don't will be considered squatters and removed. This is our land, one of the elders said, his voice shaking with anger. My father's father lived here. We have more right to it than any paper from Washington. I understand your frustration, the agent said in a tone that suggested he didn't understand at all. But the law is the law. You have 6 months. I suggest you use that time wisely. After he left, the settlement erupted in argument. Some wanted to file the claims, to work within the system, even if it felt like surrender. Others refused on principle, insisting that participating in the allotment process was accepting the legitimacy of theft. Still others advocated for leaving entirely, moving deeper into the mountains or joining relatives who'd been relocated west decades ago. Mali listened to all of it, his expression thoughtful, contributing little. When the gathering finally dispersed, people returning to their homes to discuss options with their families, he remained standing in the center of the settlement. Staring at nothing, Martha approached cautiously. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that sometimes there are no good choices, Mali said, his voice heavy. Only choices that hurt less than others. What will you do? I don't know yet. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes troubled. This land has been in my family for generations, but without proper papers, without recognition from the government, it's like we don't exist. The allotment system is designed to break up tribal lands, to force us to think like individuals instead of communities. But refusing to participate might mean losing everything. Martha reached out instinctively, placing her hand on his arm. I'm sorry, she said inadequately. I wish there was something I could do. Mali covered her hand with his, and the touch sent electricity through Martha's body. You're already doing it, he said quietly. You're here. That matters. They stood like that for a long moment, hands touching, something unspoken passing between them. Then voices approached, other families seeking Mali's counsel. And they separated, the moment broken but not forgotten. Over the following weeks, the settlement was consumed with debate about the land issue. Mali spent long hours in consultation with the elders, trying to find a path forward that honored their principles while protecting their homes. Martha watched him shoulder this burden, saw the weight of leadership aging him. Making him seem older than his 26 years, she helped where she could, using her literacy to read through the complex legal documents the land agent had left, explaining provisions and loopholes in language people could understand. She wrote letters for families who wanted to file claims but couldn't write English themselves. She documented testimonies about historical occupation, creating records that might support their case if it came to legal challenges. It was during this work that she realized how completely the settlement had become her home, how invested she was in its survival. These people had taken her in when she had nothing, had treated her with kindness and respect, had given her purpose and community. The thought of them being displaced, of this place being destroyed by bureaucratic cruelty, filled her with rage one evening as she sat with Mali going through yet another set of documents by lamplight. She said, "There has to be something more we can do. Some way to fight this that doesn't involve just accepting their terms." Mali rubbed his eyes tiredly. Like what? We have no legal standing. No lawyers who'd take our case. No money to pay them if we did. The system isn't designed for us to win, Martha. It's designed to make our resistance too expensive to maintain. Then we make noise, Martha said, an idea forming. We go to the territorial capital, tell our story to anyone who'll listen. We contact newspapers, religious organizations, anyone who might care about justice. We make it harder for them to ignore you. Molly looked at her with surprise and something that might have been admiration. That's not a bad idea, he said slowly. But it would require someone who could speak English fluently, who could navigate white society, who could tell our story in ways they'd understand. I could do it, Martha said immediately. I could go to the capital, could speak to officials and journalists. I'm white, which means they'll listen to me in ways they won't listen to you. It's not fair, but we can use it. It's too dangerous, Molly said, shaking his head. You'd be alone in a city, vulnerable. And what if someone recognized you from Gaines Creek? It's been almost a year, Martha argued. And I'll be careful. Besides, what's the alternative? Sitting here waiting to be removed? I can help, Molly. Let me help. They argued about it for another hour, Martha insisting she could make a difference, Molly worried about the risks. Finally, he agreed to present the idea to the Council of Elders, letting them decide. To Martha's surprise and Molly's clear concern, they approved it. The settlement would pool resources to fund her trip, and she would leave within the week. The night before her departure, Martha couldn't sleep. She lay in her sleep-in area, listening to the familiar sounds of the household, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. She'd spent months building safety and stability, and now she was voluntarily walking back into the world that had broken her. What if she couldn't handle it? What if she failed and let everyone down? She was still awake when she heard movement in the main room. Carefully, she emerged from behind the partition to find Molly sitting by the dying fire, unable to sleep either. He looked up when she approached, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Couldn't sleep either, Martha said, settling onto the bench beside him. Too much on my mind, Molly admitted. I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong with your trip. Asterisk, I'll be careful, Martha assured him. I promise. It's not just that, Molly said, turning to face her. Martha, I need to tell you something before you go, because if I don't say it now, I might never have the courage again. Martha's heart began to race. What is it? I care about you, Molly said, the words coming out in a rush. Not just as a friend, not just as someone I helped. I care about you as a man cares about a woman. I think I have for months now, but I didn't want to say anything because I knew you were still healing, still grieving your husband. But now you're leaving, and I can't let you go without knowing how I feel. Martha stared at him, her mind reeling. She'd suspected, had felt the connection growing between them, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. Molly, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted quickly. I'm not asking for anything, not expecting you to feel the same way. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that if something happened to you out there, if I never got to tell you, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. Martha reached out and took his hand. Feeling the calluses from years of work, the warmth of his skin against hers. I care about you too, she said quietly. I've been fighting it, feeling guilty about it, wondering if it was real or just gratitude. But it's real, Molly. What I feel for you is real. But, Molly prompted gently, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But I'm scared, Martha admitted. Scared of losing someone again, scared of dishonoring Thomas's memory, scared that I'm not ready even though my heart says I am. I don't know how to do this, how to love again after loss. Neither do I, Molly said, moving closer until their shoulders touched. But maybe we figure it out together. One step at a time, like everything else. Martha turned to look at him, at his face so close to hers, at the warmth and understanding in his eyes. When I come back, she said slowly, when this is over and the settlement is safe, can we try? Can we see if this is something real and lasting? I'll wait as long as you need, Molly said, lifting his free hand to gently cup her cheek. I've already waited this long. I can wait longer. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Martha didn't pull away. She met him halfway, and their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of promise. It wasn't like kissing Thomas had been. Wasn't meant to be a replacement or a copy. It was something new, something that honored the past while reaching toward the future. When they finally separated, both breathing a little faster, Martha rested her forehead against Molly's. I'll come back, she whispered. I promise I'll come back. You better, Molly said. And she could hear the smile in his voice, even though she couldn't see it. Because now I have even more reason to worry about you. They sat together by the fire until it burned down to embers, talking quietly about hopes and fears, and the uncertain future stretching before them. When Martha finally returned to her sleeping area, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She was still scared about the journey ahead, still uncertain about navigating her feelings, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had someone who cared, someone who saw her completely and wanted her anyway. That was worth fighting for, worth coming back for. The next morning, the entire settlement gathered to see Martha off. She wore a borrowed dress that was more respectable than her usual work clothes, her hair neatly braided. A small bag containing her few possessions and the carefully prepared documents slung across her shoulder. Ayanna embraced her tightly, whispering prayers in Choctaw. Nita gave her a small basket of food for the journey. The elders offered words of encouragement and gratitude. Molly walked with her to the edge of the settlement, where a trader who regularly traveled to the capital had agreed to let her accompany his wagon. They stood awkwardly for a moment, aware of all the eyes watching them, unsure how to say goodbye. Be safe, Molly finally said. Be smart. And come back to us. I will, Martha promised. Take care of your family while I'm gone. Take care of yourself. She wanted to kiss him again, wanted to throw her arms around him and feel his strength one more time before she left, but propriety and the watching crowd held her back. Instead, she squeezed his hand once, quickly, and then turned to climb onto the wagon before she could change her mind. As the wagon pulled away and the settlement grew smaller behind her, Martha looked back one last time. Molly stood where she'd left him, his hand raised in farewell, and she raised hers in return. Then she turned to face forward, toward the capital, toward the unknown, toward whatever came next. She was scared, but she was also determined. She had people counting on her, a community that had become family, and a future worth fighting for. She would do this. She would make them listen. And then she would come home. The journey to the territorial capital took 4 days by wagon. 4 days of dusty roads and uncomfortable sleeping arrangements at way stations where Martha was the only woman among rough traders and frontiersmen. She kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, clutching her bag of documents like a lifeline. The trader who'd agreed to transport her was a taciturn man named Jessup, who asked no questions and offered no conversation, which suited Martha fine. She needed the time to think, to prepare, to steel herself for what lay ahead. The capital was larger than any settlement Martha had seen since leaving Fort Smith as a young woman. Buildings rose 2 and 3 stories high, constructed of brick and painted wood instead of the rough lumber and adobe she'd grown accustomed to. Streets were laid out in grids, crowded with wagons and horses, and people moving with apparent purpose. The noise was overwhelming after months of mountain quiet. The constant rumble of wheels on packed earth. The shouts of vendors selling goods, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The barking of dogs and the laughter of children. Jessup dropped her at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Halloway, a pinch-faced woman who looked Martha up and down with obvious disapproval before naming a price that consumed most of the money the settlement had scraped together for this trip. Martha paid without argument, knowing she had no choice, and accepted the key to a small room on the second floor, that smelled of old tobacco and boiled cabbage. She spent the first evening sitting on the narrow bed, fighting the urge to flee back to the mountains. The city felt hostile and alien, full of strangers who moved through their lives without seeing her, without caring whether she succeeded or failed. But she'd made a promise, and she intended to keep it. She pulled out the documents she'd prepared, reviewing them by candlelight, rehearsing what she would say to anyone who'd listen. The next morning, Martha began her campaign. She started at the Territorial Land Office, an imposing brick building where clerks shuffled papers behind tall desks and spoke in clipped, official tones that made everything sound final and unchallengeable. She waited for 2 hours on a hard wooden bench before a clerk finally deigned to acknowledge her presence. "I'm here to file an appeal regarding land claims in the Kiamichi territory," Martha said, proud that her voice remained steady despite her nervousness. "There's a settlement of Choctaw families who've lived on that land for generations, and they're being threatened with removal," the clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually bored expression, barely glanced at her. "Appeals go through the territorial court. You'll need a lawyer." "Next, but I have documentation," Martha persisted, pulling papers from her bag. "Testimonies, historical records, proof of continuous occupation. Ma'am, I process paperwork. I don't make legal decisions. You need a lawyer." "Next," Martha stood her ground. "Can you at least tell me how to find a lawyer who might take this case?" The clerk sighed with theatrical patience. "There's a list of registered attorneys posted in the courthouse across the street. But I'll save you some time. Most of them won't touch Indian land disputes. Not enough money in it, and the outcome is usually predetermined anyway." "Next," dismissed, Martha made her way to the courthouse, a grand building with white columns that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Inside, she found the list the clerk had mentioned, dozens of names with office addresses. She spent the rest of the day walking from office to office, telling her story to lawyers who ranged from sympathetic but unwilling to outright hostile. "These people need to understand that progress requires sacrifice," one attorney told her, leaning back in his leather chair with the confidence of someone who'd never sacrificed anything. "The territory needs to develop, needs to attract settlers and investment. Letting small groups of Indians hold up that process isn't sustainable." "They're not holding up progress," Martha argued, struggling to keep her temper in check. "They're asking for recognition of their rights, for the government to honor its own laws. The law is whatever serves the greater good," the attorney said dismissively. "And the greater good means opening these lands for proper development." "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." By the end of the first day, Martha had been rejected by 8 lawyers. By the end of the second day, the count had risen to 15. She returned to the boarding house each evening exhausted and discouraged, eating the meager meals Mrs. Halloway provided and wondering if this entire trip had been a futile gesture. On the third day, she changed tactics. If the legal system wouldn't listen, perhaps public opinion would. She visited the offices of the territorial newspaper, a 2-story building that smelled of ink and hot metal. The editor was a grizzled man named Horatio Finch who looked like he'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "I have a story you might be interested in," Martha said, standing in the doorway of his cluttered office. "About a Choctaw settlement being displaced despite having legitimate historical claims to their land." Finch looked up from the page proofs he was reviewing, his expression skeptical. "And you are?" "Martha Colvin. I've been living with this community for the past 7 months. I've documented their histories, their claims, their right to stay on land that's been theirs for generations." "Let me guess," Finch said, setting down his pen. "You want me to write a sympathetic piece about how the poor Indians are being mistreated by the big bad government." "I want you to write the truth," Martha said firmly. "Whether that truth is sympathetic or not depends on your conscience." Something in her tone must have intrigued him because Finch gestured to a chair. "Sit. Tell me your story." "No promises, but I'll listen." Martha sat and began to talk. She told him about the settlement, about families who'd lived on that land since before Oklahoma was even a territory. She told him about Molly's family, about Ayana's stories of surviving removal and choosing to stay when others left. She told him about the community's contributions to the region, their peaceful coexistence with neighboring settlements, their willingness to work within the system if the system would acknowledge their humanity. Finch listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When Martha finished, he sat back and studied her with shrewd eyes. "You know what's going to happen if I print this story, don't you? I'll get letters from angry readers calling me an Indian sympathizer. Advertisers might pull their business. The territorial government won't be happy, but you'll also get letters from people who care about justice," Martha countered. "From religious groups, from reformers, from anyone who still believes the government should honor its word. And those voices matter too." Finch was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll run the story. But I'm going to need names, specific details, documentation. And I want to interview you properly, get direct quotes. Can you come back tomorrow?" "Yes," Martha said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," Finch warned. "A newspaper story won't stop the land office, but it might make some people uncomfortable enough to reconsider. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for." Over the next 2 days, Martha worked with Finch to craft a detailed article about the settlement situation. He was a tough interviewer, challenging her assertions, demanding proof for every claim, but he was also fair. The article that eventually ran on the front page of the territorial paper was honest and compelling, painting a picture of people caught between bureaucratic indifference and legal technicalities. The response was immediate and divided. Some readers wrote in support, offering donations or legal assistance. Others penned angry rebuttals, insisting that Indians had no place holding up territorial progress. The controversy generated more coverage, with other papers picking up the story, editorials appearing both for and against the settlement's cause. Martha used the attention to her advantage. She spoke to anyone who'd listen, religious leaders, reform organizations, politicians who claimed to care about justice. She gave interviews to other newspapers, always staying on message, always emphasizing the human cost of bureaucratic decisions. She was professional, articulate, and passionate. And slowly, incrementally, public opinion began to shift. 3 weeks into her stay in the capital, Martha received an unexpected visitor at the boarding house. A well-dressed man in his 50s introduced himself as Harold Beckwith, an attorney with the territorial bar who'd been following her campaign with interest. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of representing your community," he said, settling into the boarding house's cramped parlor. "Pro bono, of course." Martha's heart leaped. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've spent 30 years practicing law in this territory, and I've seen how the allotment system works," Beckwith said bluntly. "It's theft dressed up in legal language, and it's wrong. I can't promise we'll win, but I can promise we'll make them work for it. Make it expensive and embarrassing enough that maybe they'll think twice next time." "That would be incredible," Martha said, hardly daring to believe their luck. "What do you need from us?" "Everything you've got. Documentation, testimonies, historical records. And I'll need to visit the settlement, interview people directly, build a case that can withstand legal scrutiny." They spent the next several days working together, Beckwith reviewing Martha's carefully prepared documents and asking probing questions about the settlement's history and current situation. He was impressed by the thoroughness of her work, complimenting her organizational skills and attention to detail. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her. "You've got the mind for it." "I just want to help my community," Martha said simply. A month after arriving in the capital, Martha finally allowed herself to believe they might actually succeed. The legal wheels were turning slowly, but they were turning. Beckwith had filed formal appeals and motions that forced the land office to postpone any removal actions. The newspaper coverage had generated enough public pressure that, Territorial officials were being asked uncomfortable questions. It wasn't victory yet, but it was progress. She wrote letters to the settlement whenever she could, sending them via traders who traveled between the capital and the mountains. She wrote to Ayanna about her progress, to the Council of Elders about legal developments, and to Molly. Letters that started professional, but gradually became more personal, sharing not just facts but feelings, hopes, fears. The loneliness she felt being away from the place that had become home. Molly wrote back when he could, his letters arriving sporadically depending on when traders made the journey. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter in English formed with concentration, and Martha treasured every word. He told her about the settlement's preparations for winter, about small victories and daily struggles, about how much he missed her presence. "The cabin feels empty without you," he wrote in one letter. "Come home soon, Martha. Come home safe." Reading his words, sitting alone in her small rented room, Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been gone 6 weeks now, and the separation felt like a physical ache. But she couldn't come home yet, not until the job was finished. Not until she'd done everything possible to secure the settlement's future. In mid-September, Beckwith finally got a hearing scheduled with the territorial court. It would be an initial proceeding to determine whether the case had sufficient merit to proceed to a full trial. But it was a crucial step. If they won, the settlement would have legal protection while the case played out. If they lost, removal could proceed immediately. Martha spent days preparing for the hearing, reviewing testimonies, organizing documents, helping Beckwith refine his arguments. On the morning of the hearing, she dressed in her best borrowed clothes and walked to the courthouse with her heart pounding. The government's attorney was exactly what Martha expected, confident and dismissive, arguing that the allotment system was legal and necessary. Beckwith countered with passion and precision, citing legal precedents, invoking treaties that had never been properly implemented, presenting Martha's documentation as evidence of continuous occupation. He called Martha to testify, and she spoke clearly about what she'd witnessed, about families who'd lived there for generations. The judge announced he would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 30 days. Martha left the courthouse feeling exhausted and uncertain. The waiting was torture. 23 days after the hearing, a messenger arrived at the boarding house with an official envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. The judge had ruled in their favor, granting a preliminary injunction against removal and ordering a full trial to determine the settlement's legal rights. Martha sat down hard on her bed, the letter trembling in her hands. They'd won, not completely, not finally, but enough. Enough to buy time, enough to establish that the settlement deserved legal consideration. She immediately wrote to the settlement, then packed her belongings and made arrangements to return home. She'd been gone almost 2 months, and she missed the mountains with an intensity that surprised her. Missed Molly with an ache that went bone deep. The journey back took another 4 days. When the wagon finally crested the ridge overlooking the valley where the settlement lay, Martha's breath caught. Home. She was home. People emerged from cabins as word of her arrival spread. By the time Martha reached the center of the settlement, it seemed like everyone had gathered. Ayanna embraced her fiercely, tears streaming down her face. And there, standing slightly apart, his expression caught between relief and joy, was Molly. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Martha felt everything else fade away. She moved toward him until she stood directly in front of him. "I came back," she said simply. "You came back," Molly echoed, his voice rough with emotion. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and Martha wrapped her arms around him. Finally home, that evening, after she'd told her story, after the celebration had died. Down Martha and Molly walked together to their favorite spot by the creek. The autumn air was cool and crisp, and overhead the stars blazed brighter than anything she'd seen in the city. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back," Molly admitted. "Afraid the city would remind you of your old life." "This is my life now," Martha said, taking his hand. "Here, with you, with your family, with this community. This is where I belong. I love you, Molly. I'm ready to build a future with you." Molly's expression transformed, joy breaking across his face. "I love you too," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "I have for so long." This kiss was different from their first. Not tentative or questioning, but sure and deep and full of promise. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Martha smiled. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we live," Molly said simply. "We fight for our home, we build our future, and we live." 6 months later, Martha and Molly were married in a ceremony that blended Choctaw traditions with customs Martha remembered from her childhood. Ayanna wove them a wedding blanket in the traditional style, and the entire settlement celebrated with food and dancing and stories. The legal battle for the settlement's land continued for another 2 years, with hearings and appeals and setbacks and small victories. But with Beckwith's help and Martha's tireless advocacy, they eventually won a landmark ruling that recognized the settlement's historical claims and granted them legal protection. Other communities facing similar displacement used their case as precedent, and slowly the system began to change. Martha never returned to Gaines Creek, never reclaimed her old life or the shore Thomas had owned. That life belonged to someone she used to be. Instead, she and Molly built a new home beside his mother's cabin, and Martha continued teaching the settlement's children while documenting the stories and traditions that connected past to future. She thought of Thomas sometimes, remembered their life together with fondness rather than pain, and she believed he would have been happy for her. Happy that she'd found the strength to love again, to build again, to choose life over surrender. Years later, when people asked Martha how she'd ended up in a Choctaw settlement in the Kiamichi Mountains, she would tell them the truth. She'd been lost, living like a frightened creature in a cave, waiting to die. And a man named Molly had refused to let that happen, had pulled her back into the world with patience and kindness. He'd saved her life, and in saving hers, she'd helped save his community. They'd rescued each other. And that, she would say with a smile, was how she'd finally found her way home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.